Okay, so perhaps we can make a start. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where this finds you. And I hope it finds you in good health. And welcome to this online seminar, which is being hosted with the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation, which is focused on norms for outer space, a giant leap for policymaking ? And I think the question mark is important in this discussion. My name is James Revel. I'm the program lead for WMD and other strategic weapons at UNIDIR, and I will be moderating today's panel. Just before we get started with the panel discussion, though, I'm delighted to be able to introduce Mr. Pedro Arostegui, the Deputy Director General of Non-Proliferation and Disarmament at the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation, who is going to provide us all with some introductory remarks, which will precede today's discussion. So thank you for joining us, sir, and the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, James. Well, first of all, of course, thank you for offering me the chance to participate in this seminar. I would like to thank UNIDIR, of course, for co-organizing the seminar and also, well, for offering me the chance to set the stage for the debate between our distinguished panelists. Satellites and other space-based assets and services are essential for the functioning of the global economy and trade. And it is estimated that up to 60% of the global economy depends directly or indirectly on space-based tools and services. It is vital for multiple sectors, not just for science and exploration, but also for the digital economy, the fourth industrial revolution, transport, telecommunications, agriculture, or banking. States are also increasingly relying on space-based infrastructures and services for the planning and conduct of their security. Space is increasingly congested as more and more countries and actors are launching an increasing number of civilian and military satellites. Today, there are around 6,000 satellites in orbit, only about 2,200 of which are still operational. This raises the serious problem of how to handle the space debris and traffic in space. And this is aggravated now by the trend of launching larger constellations with shorter lifespans. Space is also increasingly contested. In recent years, a technological race has taken place in space between classic space powers, emerging powers, and even private companies. There have been some unilateral moves by certain state actors, and the risk of an arms race in space is growing. A decisive factor for modern military superiority is the ability to maintain and use space systems. Global positioning systems, the satellite communications network, reconnaissance satellites, etc., show the inseparability of today's military or defense system and the use of space. The existing international legal regime for outer space, based on 5 main treaties, does no longer correspond to the current reality. Rapid technical, economic, and political developments reveal new and emerging threats and risks. Spain is extremely concerned about recent developments, including the latest Russian anti-satellite missile test, which follows others carried out by other powers in recent years. These tests pose a threat to space as a whole and underline the urgent need to open a sincere debate that can eventually lead to the adoption of rules to put an end to irresponsible behavior in space. It is not just the problem posed by anti-satellite missiles or space debris, but also issues such as cyber attacks, electronic warfare, directed energy weapons, or unexpected rendezvous and proximity operations. These actions increase the risk of misunderstandings, miscalculations, and tensions that could escalate into conflicts in other domains. This situation makes it more urgent than ever to work towards a commonly agreed regulatory framework for space. In 2021, Spain has once again co-sponsored the British resolution at the First Commission of the General Assembly on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior as a new way to advance efforts on improving space security. The broad support that the resolution received reflects the rising fears of many states. It also shows that many of them favor an approach that prioritizes transparency, confidence building measures, and voluntary rules as a first step. The views submitted by member states and other organizations with regard to last year's British resolution also show that there is already some level of agreement on certain types of behavior that can help mitigate security risks in space. Compliance with international law, the sharing of space situational awareness data, improved verification measures, and the establishment of de-escalation mechanisms were topics raised by many states, and this offers some ground for optimism. However, there is still a long way to go. In recent years, Spain, like other countries, has made significant efforts in this area, such as the approval of the Spanish Aerospace Security Strategy and the National Cybersecurity Strategy, or the creation of the Space Surveillance Operations Center in Torrejón de Ardoz near Madrid. In May this year, our government also announced a future Spanish space agency, which will be responsible for managing Spain's space program. At around the same time, the European Union established its first space program, a milestone that adds to the excellent public diplomacy work it carries out through the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium's seminars on safety, security, and sustainability issues in outer space. Beyond national or regional strategies, the work of universities, research institutes, and organizations such as UNIDIA remains essential. Given that space is an enormously technical sector, the understanding of which gives us diplomats enormous headaches, I can admit, it is vitally important to have space security experts on board for this norm-setting exercise. They are essential for a range of tasks, such as helping define key terms relating to space security and offering a neutral perspective in an area where geostrategic interests are increasingly important. They also perform invaluable public diplomacy work. We are therefore proud to co-organize this event with UNIDIA and are deeply grateful to the Institute and to all the panelists for their participation. So thank you all, and I really look forward to an insightful and thought-provoking debate.
Thank you, Mr. Aristegi. I think for your kind words, but also for the importance and highlighting some of the challenges that we face. This links neatly into some further comments from myself, really about how some of the work that we're doing here, and the work in the Outer Space Security Conference in September, and the work of space researchers, it's become increasingly clear that space is critical to modern life on Earth, as you reflected. But it also is clear that as it becomes more economically and strategically important, tensions between different space actors are heightening in a manner that could lead to conflict with potentially catastrophic consequences. I think we see the accelerating proliferation of counterspace capabilities, as well as the enactment of national policies that deem space an operational or warfighting domain, really does underline the very real nature of threats that exist and highlights the importance of keeping space peaceful. To address these challenges, as many as you know, many have called for more robust norms of behaviour in outer space. And this is a key part of the recent resolution we just heard about on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviour. And this is one of the things that we want to get into today as part of a wider critical exploration of the role of norms as a mechanism to regulate behaviour in outer space, and the role they could play in potentially contributing to the prevention of an arms race in outer space. I should also add, consistent with the point made about the significance of neutrality, we'll also sort of attend to some of the limits here as well, because I think that's an important area to discuss. The format of today's event will be a moderated discussion, in which we'll begin with some questions from myself before opening out to Q&A from the audience. I should also note this event is being recorded, and we'll make this available on the UNIDIA YouTube channel in the coming days. If you would like to participate, and in order to make efficient use of our time, we're going to request that audience members who would like to pose a question or submit a comment, please use the Q&A function to submit written questions. This should be available at the bottom of your screen. I think most people are familiar with Zoom meetings now, so I won't go into details there. One other thing I would add, though, is if you would like to be identified in my relaying a question to the panelists, please do put your name in the box as well. Otherwise, this will be treated anonymously. I will try to get to as many questions as possible, but obviously we do have a limited amount of time, so it may not be possible to answer everybody's question. And with, well, one final note, I think we want to be very clear that all panelists are speaking in their personal capacity in this and indeed most of our Unidir events. And with that, if I can begin with an introduction of the panelists. First, we have Almudena Azcarate Ortega, who is the space researcher here in the WMD and other strategic weapons program at Unidir. We're also joined by Jessica West, who is a senior researcher at Project Ploughshares and managing editor of the International Space Security Index project. And then our third guest is Jinyuan Su, who is a professor of international law at Wuhan University and an expert in international space law, international law of the sea, and international air law, and he has published widely in these areas. I'm delighted you've all been able to join us, and thank you for taking the time. And if I could perhaps kick off the discussion by two what seem fairly basic questions, although I'd be interested to see the response here. But first, what are norms? And secondly, how do these actually work in general terms from your experience? And perhaps if I could begin with you, Jessica, if you want to take that first, before moving to you, Jinyuan, and then Almudena. Please, the floor is yours, Jessica.
Yes, thank you so much. What are norms? You're right, it seems like a very basic question, and you'll probably get lots of different answers. For myself, I bristle a little bit when in policy circles, norms are usually referred as voluntary rules, in contrast with legal agreements, things that we must do. And I just think that norms are so much more than that. In my mind, norms are the glue of collective governance. They fill in the gaps between law, they tell us how it's practiced, and they hold together societies in their day-to-day interactions with one another. I think there's a few key elements to understand about norms. I break it down into sort of three different core qualities. Rules of behavior. Norms inform and are reflected in behavior. So yes, they're voluntary, but they shape how we behave and how we interact with others. I think shared values is important. The behaviors that are motivated by norms are often rooted in shared values and social expectations about what is appropriate, what should we be doing as we conduct ourselves. And the third is expectations of compliance. This means that when there are strong norms in place, there's a strong sense of a social or a moral obligation to comply. We expect this behavior to be observed widely. Otherwise, it's not really a norm. And so norms might not be law, but we still expect them to be followed. And importantly, we notice when they're not. And I think that noticing when they're not observed is really the key aha moment of norms. They can be hard to identify when they're widely practiced, but they stand out when they're violated. And I think you see this every day in social settings. I like to use the example of, shoes in the house. If I ask you shoes on or shoes off, you'll probably have a very strong response to the answer of that question and be like, Jessica, why would you ask me this? The answer is so obvious. And the expectation of what is proper behavior in that situation to you is probably very strong and obvious. And I think that points to the fact that there's a strong norm in place. And so if I go to your home and violate that norm, I'm not going to be arrested. I haven't done anything legally wrong, but I probably won't be invited back again because I'm a bad guest and I didn't comply with social expectations. And we see these not just in daily life, but in international law as well. I think debris mitigation is probably one of the strongest norms that we have in space, and we notice when that norm is violated. We notice when there's non-compliance. It bristles us. We know that something was done wrong. And I think that gets to a final fourth point about norms is they're deeply linked to identity. Norms motivate behavior, not only because they correspond to a sense of what is proper and what is expected, but also because expectations of what is proper are tied to specific identities. By conforming with normative behavior, we signal to others who we are. Am I a good guest? Am I a responsible citizen? Am I a non-threatening state? So I think norms are also important for signaling and conveying our identities and our intents to others. So there might not be law, but I think that they really do help to smooth out daily interactions, regular interactions in a collective setting. And they bind us together in as a society and as an international community.
Thanks, Jessica. I think it's a really good start to this discussion. I particularly like the idea of glue of collective governance, and also privately slightly concerned that I have 2 kids who are regular norm violators in other people's houses, which is always a little bit worrying. If I could move to you, Jinwan, perhaps if you could take the same question, I'd welcome your views and whether you agree or not. Please, the floor's yours, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, James. So with respect to the question as to what are norms, I agree with Jessica, and thank you, Jessica, for asking me to read your article on norms co-authored with Almudena, and I agree. And I think you put it very well with respect to the definition of norms. So I just because since I'm an international lawyer, so I would like to focus more on the interaction between norms and law. First of all, I think in international law, we have a very close notion or concept, which is called soft law. And I think you have also mentioned in your article, these are very similar concepts. Of course, there are people who say that soft law is in itself a self-contradictory notion, because law is always hard and there's no such law which is soft. But anyway, I agree that norms are important, and it's kind of rules that we do have in our society, in the international community, and people and states do comply with them. So it is a social science concept. It is something that ought to be conformed with, although there's no such legal obligation. So the expectation is social or political rather than legal. With respect to the question, how do norms work? First of all, I think norms have their own value. So although they are not legal obligations, states and people do comply with them. Although not from a legal sense, I think they are very important in the transitional period before states could agree upon some kind of very contested problem, such as arms control in outer space. And second of all, I think as a process, for instance, the negotiation of norms is important because they contribute to lawmaking. And I think we are going to go into this question in more detail later. How they contributed, the negotiation of legally binding instruments, for example. So as a process, they also have values. And third of all, I think with respect to the substance of norms, they do interact with law. And for instance, they are very important practice of states that which we should take into account in interpreting and applying international law. They may be codified later if states feel that they have come to such a point that they regard them as legal obligations, and they may be transformed into customary international law if the practice is widespread and there is such legal sense. So yeah, very briefly, thank you, James. I pass the mic back to you.
Thank you, Jinwan. I think that's really useful. I particularly take your point on the value of norms in a transitional period and that idea of a sort of interaction between legal measures and normative measures. I think that's really useful, and something we see across the history of arms control, with norms and laws often being mutually reinforcing. Now I'd like to hand over to you, Almudena. Please, the floor's yours.
Thank you, James. Well, I think Jessica and Jinwan have summarized really well what norms are, but I'd like to build on some of the things that they've said. Jessica pointed out that it seems like a very simple question, but it's not. And I completely agree with this, because I think the answer to this question will in a way depend on who you ask. If you ask a social scientist, you will get a definition that's very similar to the one that Jessica provided. But if you ask a lawyer, the definition might be slightly different. And also depending on the language that the person that you ask speaks, the answer will be slightly different. For example, in Spanish, the word norm is often used as a synonym for any type of rule. They can be binding, they can be non-binding. So it's really important to have a common understanding when we come into a discussion on these issues. It's very important that we all have a common understanding on what we mean when we talk about norms. And I wanted to build upon the point that Jin Yuan made on the relationship between non-binding normative mechanisms and binding mechanisms, because this issue that I just brought up on what would a lawyer say when you ask them what a norm is. Norms can be not just social norms, as was described with Jessica, but they can be legal norms. And legal norms are often described as law as an order of human behavior. They can, so in this sense, norms would be what the law ought to be by navigating the values and the reasons that underpin society's behavior. So in this sense, it's really interesting to observe that there is a link between this non-binding and this binding mechanisms that can be used to regulate any issue, including space security. And they are often perceived, or they have in the past at least, been perceived as sort of like two different school of thoughts. The school of thought of norms, which talks about non-binding mechanisms, and the school of thought that talks about treaties and agreements. But I really liked what Yin Yuan said about how one can lead to the other through becoming customary international law, as Jessica said, if the practice is widespread enough. And this essence of how norms can eventually turn and become something more binding, it can be found in the definition itself, depending on who you ask. And I think this is a really important aspect. I do think that for the purposes of this discussion and for the purposes of the discussions currently being held at the General Assembly revolving around Resolution 7536 on responsible behaviours in outer space, the social science definition is probably the most used and the one that is most understood to define norms. So I think it's useful to stick with that for this conversation. But I think it's interesting to acknowledge this point of the complexity of a definition.
Thanks, Amadina. I think it's good to be aware of really the idea of legal norms, and that it can almost seem more complicating, but I think having recognizing different understandings is useful and important. I'm encouraged to see we're starting to get some questions. I think we have one from Aditha. Forgive my pronunciation if you're in the audience. Please do feel free to submit further questions. We will get to those. But before we do, perhaps I can put another question which participants have already touched upon already, but it's really the question of how we can link norms to space-related issues. So how can norms contribute to space security and sustainability? And how could they, for example, aid in arms control in space to achieve the goals of Paros? And perhaps if I may start with you, Jinwan, before moving to Jessica and Almudena, and then Jessica, if that's okay. Please, so you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, James. So I think the question is how norms can aid space arms control to achieve the goal of Paros, for example. I think, first of all, norms are very important transparency and confidence building measures. So, for instance, in order to conclude norms, we have to start negotiation. And I think to start negotiation itself is builds confidence. Sometimes it's always to really kick the ball rolling. So I think start negotiation is in itself builds confidence. And I think there's one advantage of norms, which is it is sometimes easier to start that in terms of domestic approval procedures. To begin negotiating a treaty and to begin negotiating, a non-legally binding instrument is quite different. And this is also true with respect to the adoption or the approval of such an instrument. And second of all, I think it contributes to space arms control by fostering consensus. So during the negotiation, I think we can identify the divergence or convergence of views between different states. And during the negotiation, the positions of states may change. Third of all, I think there's also another aspect we should not neglect, which is capacity building. I think sometimes states want to comply, there's political will, but they do not have such capacity, at least at the moment. And I think there are, for instance, there are some non-legally binding norms which allow states to comply with the norms in a progressive manner. And sometimes we can also, for instance, in the LTS, we are also now discussing capacity building, which helps states which do not have capacity to acquire the necessary capacity. So I think it helps. So I think most importantly, norms can contribute to space arms control by transparency and confidence building. Of course, there's another question as to whether norms can contribute directly to the limitation of military rights. I think in this respect, it might be limited. States really do not easily commit themselves to arms control obligations, either legal or non-legal. So I think in this respect, it might be limited. So third of all, I think norms sometimes, they may limit military activities in outer space by constraining the exterior impacts, for example, by protecting the environment or by protecting the corresponding rights of other states. Well, sometimes it helps, but sometimes not, because, for instance, we have some guidelines on debris, for example, but we can also see sometimes states, for all kinds of reasons, for instance, for security reasons, they test the anti-satellite weapons. So it helps sometimes, but it may not, because states, they need to balance between different interests, and then they make the final decision. And once this happens, there's no legal obligations to buy, which was violated. So I think the biggest contribution perhaps is to promote transparency and confidence building. Thank you, James.
No, thank you. I'd also take the point you made earlier about the process and sort of identifying areas of divergence and convergence through discussions also seems really useful to draw out, as well as your point on capacity building as well. So thank you. If I can turn over to you, Almudena, please, the floor's yours.
Absolutely, and I agree with Jinyuan. I think that one thing that norms can be very useful for is the building of trust, the building of confidence. And I think that's especially useful in domains or areas that might be a little bit more difficult to reach that, general consensus due to negotiations being politically or diplomatically tense, or because of technological issues that have yet to be fully understood or fully developed. So in this sense, because norms reside in social values instead of law, although as Jessica mentioned, that does not mean that there is no expectations of compliance there. They tend to be perceived as easier to initiate or easier to adapt through political means. And that means that in tricky domains, such as, for example, can be space security, states could be more flexible and more willing to sit down and talk about these issues when they know that the thing that is going to bind them together, so to say, is not going to be law, but rather is going to be a common understanding, a set of common social values. And that does not mean that could eventually later on become something else, like Jinyuan previously said. through customary international law or through other means, it could eventually become binding law. But in this sense, space, for example, is a very rapidly changing domain. So norms can be particularly useful to kind of like build this common understanding and this common trust that is needed to achieve those goals that Jinyuan mentioned, those goals of the prevention of an arms race in our space.
Thank you, Amir. I think that point on being easier to adapt in what is quite a tricky and quite a fluid context is important. I'll hand over to you now, Jessica. Please, the floor's yours.
Yeah. Norms are really at the heart of arms control, all arms control. Norms of behavior, of how we use weapons and what the limits of those uses are. And you can see this when you look at other domains. The very existence of core principles that drive agreements, principles of non-use are at the heart of bans on weapons of mass destruction. Humanitarian norms of civilian protection have informed restrictions on the use of indiscriminate weapons, such as landmines and cluster bombs. Principles of equality, stability, and non-interference even influenced bilateral strategic arms control agreements. All of these principles and practice can still hold, even if there's not an agreement in place. So the norms exist aside from the agreement, but they're also at the heart of all of our legal agreements on arms control. All of these norms might apply to outer space, but there's no consensus on this right now, and there's no concrete understanding about how they apply in practice. And honestly, I think we have a crisis of norms in space. We have competing interpretations of our core principle, peaceful use. What does that mean? What are the limits? How do I signal to others that my intentions in space are peaceful? And even with the concept of PAROS, prevention of an arms race in outer space, we have different interpretations of what that means. What does it entail? How are we preventing an arms race? And I think that is a grave danger, to have such muddy waters at the core of our arms control program on space. And I think it leads to a crisis of confidence as well. There's a mismatch between what we say or what we put on paper sometimes and what takes place in practice. And that leads to lack of confidence in the intentions of others and in our belief that others will uphold international obligations. And it's hard to move forward on arms control in that kind of a situation. And so I think, we need to get serious about our conversations and our agreement on building a common understanding of the core principles that inform arms control in outer space and what they mean. And then B, we need to hammer out more detailed rules of behavior so that we collectively have an ability to signal to others that our intentions match up with our stated goals, so that we can avoid the escalation of conflict, which nobody wants and everyone is committed to avoiding, but we just don't have very good tools in place at the moment. And I think norms is a good place to start. As Jinyuan said, the process itself is critical. And going back to Almudena's point about, different cultures, it's important that we come together, not just from, legal and social science perspectives, but different countries and different users of space might have different values and opinions about what these concepts means. And it's just so important that we become very clear on what we want to do in space, where we want to go, and how we get there. Thanks.
Thank you. I certainly echo your point on norms as being at the heart of arms control and disarmament, to the point that many speak of a taboo against chemical and biological weapons, which is seems to be a certain embodiment of norms. It can be disagreed, but before opening this up, I did want to touch on one last question from myself. And Jinyuan, you touched upon this earlier. We've spoken a lot about the potential of norms, but there are also going to be limitations as to what these can do. And I was reminded of one comment during the Outer Space Security Conference earlier this year, which critically dismissed norms as being loose, vague, and subjective. So I thought it might be good to sort of challenge the panelists on their views on what are the limitations of norms and how can these limitations be overcome. And perhaps, Almudena, if we could start with you on this before going to Jinyuan and then Jessica, if that's okay. Please, the floor is yours, Almudena.
Sure, absolutely. So definitely, as has been said throughout this webinar, norms have a lot of positive attributes, but that does not mean that they are the be-all end-all of arms control or regulations for space security. That is for sure. There are definite challenges or limitations that norms have. I think one of them is the fact that to be effective, they have to be very widely accepted and practiced. It's not enough to just proclaim a norm. People actually have to follow through with it. And this is closely related to the issue of enforcement. So, for example, binding mechanisms have the advantage of once they enter into force, international law provides for mechanisms to enforce treaties. But that does not happen in the same way with norms, which makes them in a way less permanent and can cause them to wither and die with time if states do not comply in perhaps not a uniform, but certainly a wide and spread out way. I think an additional challenge is that verification or monitoring of compliance with norms can be trickier than other mechanisms that are legally binding. Even when behaviours are observed, normative behaviours are observed, maybe not all states have access to the technical means needed to monitor these behaviours. And if there are no formal processes to collectively carry out this monitoring processes, as many treaties establish in their texts, it can be difficult to ensure that these norms are being complied with. So I think those would be the two main challenges that I would highlight. Over to you, Jamie.
Thank you, Madena. And perhaps if I can hand the same question over to you, Jessica, please. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Well, first, I think it's important to point out that norms are inescapable. Just because we're not actively trying to create norms doesn't mean that they don't exist. The problem is that not all norms are good norms. So norm doesn't mean normatively good. And we have a lot of bad behaviors and practices that can persist through internalization and acceptance by the community. And so the question to me is, how do we get good norms? And as Almudena pointed out, that's hard. I started off the conversation by pointing out that we kind of, norms, voluntary rules, that's easy to do. Norms are hard to do. It's hard to get, as Almudena said, from here's the norm we would like to see, here's the behavior that we would like to see, or the values that we want expressed in our behaviors. And people are internalizing that and practicing it in a way that they don't even know that they're doing it anymore, that it's normal, like taking off your shoes. That's a long and hard process. And we're at the beginning of it in space with the conversations, the articulation, the trying to point to what we want to do. But there's still a long process of, debate about what the norm will be, contestation, persuasion, institutionalization. So going from the vague concept to the more specific rule, institutionalizing it in processes and mechanisms, and then internalizing it among space actors. That's a long process. It takes a lot of commitment, and it takes participation. I think inclusion is the word I usually use. We need an inclusive process, obviously, because these are collective and they have to be shared. But I want to turn inclusion on its head. And we need participation. We need engagement by many states and by civil society and by commercial actors. We all have a responsibility to develop good norms, to institutionalize them, and to practice them. And that it's not easy. So I'm just very grateful that we have some international leadership, and I'm pleased to see how willing states have been so far to participate in good faith, to put their ideas out there, and to have the conversation. We're just at the beginning, and this will be a long road.
Thank you, Jessica. I think the point on inclusion is something which is an expectation that it will be inclusive of stakeholders, civil society actors, industry, and I think that will be important as well. Perhaps I can hand over to the same question to you, Jin, please, the floor's yours, sir.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I agree with Jessica that we need to be inclusive in developing norms which are good, and they should be institutionalized. To me, one of the challenges or limits of norms is that, so they are norms, they are not law. So I still believe that in most cases, states, if they approve or if they accept the norms, they ultimately they comply with the norms. But sometimes violation is possible, in particular when the very core interest of the state is concerned. So we have seen that, and once this happened, there's no sanction like the law has. So I think this.
While Junwan is reconnecting, perhaps I can turn to Almudena and to Jessica. One of the questions we've received from the audience kind of follows on from something Junwan was saying, and it raises, what are the historical examples of the development of non-space norms in cases where one or two states willfully disregard an established norm on national security grounds? So I think this is quite an interesting question. How does that resolve itself? I wonder whether either of you could talk to that. Perhaps I could begin with you, Jessica, if that's okay.
So the question is sort of not observing norms by military actors. Am I getting
that?
Yeah,
when it doesn't have to necessarily be about space, but when norms are disregarded willfully because of national security interests or various other reasons.
So I think that in itself speaks to a norm. In one way, is there a norm that national security actors are expected to comply with specific rules? And I think we've struggled with that a little bit. We've danced around it in space when it comes to, say, the long-term sustainability guidelines. Those were negotiated, obviously, in the context of peaceful uses, but the preamble clearly states that, there's nothing here that should be contrary to national security interests. And but then what happens when they're not followed? I think that especially when norms are weak or emerging, it's very easy to knock them off track if you have one or two stark examples of non-compliance and you don't have strong international response saying that was wrong, we expect you to comply. And so norms are a living, I don't want to say breathing, but they're a living thing. They live in our actions and they live in our reactions to those actions. And if we accept non-compliance, then we start to create a norm that compliance doesn't matter for those actors, or a bad norm that this kind of activity is acceptable. And so that's why I wanted to point to not just inclusion when it comes to norms, but participation. State, civil society, commercial, we all have to be participating in a daily basis on maintaining core norms. And if we don't have buy-in from significant military actors in space, then we're just not going to have norms that function in the way that we want them to. And so making sure that buy-in is there is important. But it points to Almudena's point. She might have more to say on that about the fragility of norms. I don't think they're as fragile as people say. But they can be, they can wither and die from neglect or from a significant action that just drastically changes the context and the way that a norm is interpreted and applied. But really, it also depends on everyone else, not just that one actor.
Thanks, Jessica. I think that's a really interesting point. I'd also add that they can wither, but also they can sometimes bounce back as well. I've always been struck by the use of gas weapons in the First World War was a violation of the Hague Declaration, St. Petersburg Declaration, but nonetheless, to some extent, that norm bounced back and actually was codified many years later. But yeah, I'm sorry, Almudena, though, I'll hand over to you on this. Please, the floor is yours.
So yes, absolutely. I like to echo the point on participation that Jessica just made, and I like to add that it's not just important that participation is widespread, but it's also important to take into account who is participating, especially when it comes to a field like space. Now we have a lot of states are space actors, but during the beginnings of space exploration, it was just a couple of states that were doing things in the space domain, that were putting satellites in space. And even now, there is certain types of technology that is only accessible or that is only being developed by certain states. So, for example, let's take the example of kinetic ASATs, which was mentioned by Mr. Arostegui in the introduction. It's great if all the states out there commit to not testing kinetic ASATs, but if those that actually possess the technology are actually the ones that decide, okay, we're actually not going to abide by these norms, then the norm itself becomes useless. And going back to the question which asked for an example, I think there is an example related to this. So in the 80s, the then Soviet Union and the United States agreed, not in a very formal way, but they agreed to establish a sort of moratorium on the use and the testing of certain technologies in space, and that stabilized the use of space in that sense for several years, and tests of kinetic ASATs, for example, were not conducted during those years. And then it eventually stopped, as the person who asked the question pointed out, due to national security reasons. I don't remember which of the states decided that due to national security reasons, they were not going to continue this moratorium, but eventually it stopped. So during those few years that this moratorium was in place, it could be understood that a sort of norm to not use certain types of technologies in space developed. But then as soon as both states declare that due to national security reasons, they weren't going to carry out with these behaviors anymore, that norm, as Jessica pointed out, withered and died. And I think we can, in a way, see it coming back, at least, if not a norm, a request for the enactment of such norm. That there are several people, experts in the field, as well as several states, that acknowledge, as Mr. Arostegui pointed out in his introduction, the dangers of space debris, for example. And that call in the comments to the Secretary General report on Resolution 7536 to avoid carrying out activities that produce space debris. So perhaps we are seeing, in a way, if not the creation of a norm, at least states and space actors in general requesting that such a norm be created or be negotiated or agreed upon. So back over to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Almudena. I'm conscious, Jinwan, are you able to hear us and your audio's back now?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now, and welcome back, sir. And I wonder whether you wanted to pick up on a particular question or finish the point you were making on the last question about the limits of norms. It's up to you where you'd like to proceed, but perhaps you'd like to finish your point on the limits first of all.
Yes. Well, basically, I was going to say, to me, the greatest challenge or limit of norms is that they are not legally binding. So I think violation is possible, and when they are violated, there's no sanction on these violations. So I think so. How can this be overcome? I think in the context of space arms control, if we regard norms as transitional to the stage of concluding a legally binding instrument on space arms control, I think perhaps that's the only way, because usually we conclude norms because we want to create a favorable environment for the negotiation of legally binding instruments. And if there's no progress on the ultimate goal, then it is possible that these norms, which are transitional, may not be respected so much. So that's the point what I wanted to make. Thank you, James.
No, thank you, Jim, and thank you for reconnecting and bearing with us. Okay. I'm now starting to see we have about 5 or 6 questions emerging in the Q&A, so I'm going to proceed to change focus to some of those questions, and I'll try and take them in order. And the first one I think is quite interesting, something that's been touched upon before, but how can norms evolve and move forward when it's clear that on some issues we have quite different perspectives? So to quote the question, the perceptions in Russia and China over conducting close passes or rendezvous proximity operations are sometimes different to those of countries like the US, France, and Japan. This idea that some of the perceptions in this context may be different. So I'm wondering if any of our panelists would like to respond to that question. How do we reconcile different perceptions around a norm in developing a norm? And really it's open, but perhaps Jessica, do you want to go first on that, or please?
Yeah, I think at some point you also have to step a little bit further back to the basic values and principles that are trying to be promoted. So what is the goal of the process going forward? Is it stability? Is it making everyone feel secure? Is it non-use of certain capabilities? But when it comes to rendezvous and proximity operations, I think stability is something that comes to mind, and not making other states feel unnecessarily threatened if that's not the intention. And it comes down to having a conversation. States need a forum where they can communicate, as the resolution on norms clearly state, where they can communicate what is viewed as threatening, what is viewed as more reassuring, and maybe coming up with a way to move forward, and so that we're not threatening and we're making other states feel reassured. And so process, there's no magic answer to any of the questions or to any what any of the norms should be. It really just comes down to state preference, state practice, and trying to find common ground and agreement. Sometimes there might be a variety of norms that would surround an issue. So when it comes to RPO, it might not just be a yes/no thing, or it might be an if/then. If we're going to get close to another satellite, then we're going to do a pre-notification, or we're going to share some orbital parameters so that we don't have an accident. I'm not a technical expert, so I'm assuming there's many more specific rules that could be followed. But I think we can take our cue from the commercial sector, which has been working hard on developing, they call them usually rules of the road, but rules so that they can operate with one another in a safe way. And I think we can do that from a security perspective as well, rules so that we can operate in a stable and non-threatening way when that is the intent, when we're focused on the peaceful use of outer space. But there's just no replacing process and dialogue. And I'm really hoping I think that's the goal of the open-ended working group, is to have that conversation. And, norms have been called subjective. Well, they are, but we can build a common subjective view. And I think building that common subjectivity is really important, building that we and shared values and understandings of what we're doing here.
Thanks, Jessica. I think that's really useful. If I could put the same question at Jinwan or Almudena, if you want to take that question before I move on. Jinwan, please, the floor is yours, sir.
Yes, I agree. So for RPO, it's important to either to have a forum which states could have dialogue, or states should keep the hotline working well in order to exchange views. But I also would like to point out, this may not solve the problem entirely, because we also need to consider, for instance, why states conduct such activities. These are the satellites of other states, and there must be some misunderstanding, for example. And I think this is also where we should work on to promote transparency, so that states, they need not conduct such activities to see what they want to see. And on the other hand, other states may not see this as kind of threat to the safety or security of their space craft. Yeah.
Thank you, Jinwan. I think that the scope for misunderstanding really does highlight the importance of an exchange of views on some of these different perspectives. But Almudena, do you want to take that question, or shall I move on to another? Please, the floor is yours.
Sure. Just very quickly, because I think already both Jessica and Jinyuan already covered that really well. But I think that the fact that there is so much room for different perceptions, and these perceptions are commonly associated to different political inclinations, alliances, rivalries, etc., is because we are lacking common understandings on how to operate in space, and in particular when it comes to these operations such as rendezvous and proximity. And I think, as Jessica mentioned, that the dialogue that will be had in the open-ended working group will hopefully make these perceptions less subjective. Perhaps subjective is not the word, because as Jessica mentioned, norms are subjective, even laws are subjective if you think about it, because they are subject to different interpretations. But at least they will ensure that everybody has the same understanding on how these operations should be conducted. And I completely agree that the space industry has a lot to contribute here, because they have as Jessica called them, the rules of the road on how to operate. They are very eager to operate when they carry out these actions, to operate in a transparent manner. And I think that states in that sense have a lot to that they could learn, or that they could implement from how the space industry operates in that regard.
Thanks, Almudena. I'm trying to cluster some of the questions that we've got here. What I propose to do, with your indulgence, is to focus on two legally orientated questions to begin with, and I'll do these together. So if there are any takers, please let me know. The first one relates to this question: could the acceptance by a state of a legal obligation on the non-deployment of weapons in outer space be one of the norms of responsible behaviour in outer space? And I'll open the floor on that shortly. The second question looks a little bit more technical here, and it's wanting the views of the panelists on jus cogens, non-derogatory norms, which is a well-known concept in international law. And the question is whether it would be helpful or to refer to this concept in relation to space. So is there value in that particular idea? So I'll open the floor on either of those two. Does anybody wish to lead the way on either of those? Jinyuan, please, you are first to unmute. The floor is yours, sir.
Yes. So on the first question, could the acceptance by a state of a legal obligation on the non-deployment of weapons in space be one of the norms of responsible behaviors? I think yes. So we have seen this as a proposal in the CD, for example, and I think in the General Assembly there is also a proposal of non-first deployment of weapons in space. I think it should be one of the norms of responsible behavior in space. I think in the proposal of responsible behavior in the General Assembly, much has been said about safeguarding the security of space-based assets, for example, But on the other hand, we have seen that there are concerns over the deployment of weapons in space, and I think this has always been a debated issue since a very early stage, as Jessica and Almudena, you highlighted in your article. So these are two schools of thought with respect to space security. And if we address one of them, it may run the risk of unevening, addressing the problem. So that's my view, James.
Thank you, Jinyuan. Does anybody else wish to take either of those? The floor is open. Should you? Almudena, please go ahead.
With regards to the first question on whether a state accepting as a legal obligation that the non-deployment of weapons could be considered a norm, I don't know if I completely agree with Jinyuan. I think it could be a norm if there is enough widespread acceptance. So if it's not just one state that commits to this in this way, if it's just one state, I think it would be a domestic regulation. In my opinion, I think it's a good domestic regulation, but other states don't have neither the legal nor the social obligation to comply with it, unless it's widespread enough, and it cannot be considered a norm. And going back to the second question, the question on use cogents, I think the question of use cogents is actually tricky, because there are, well, first of all, there are a very limited number of rules in law that could be considered use cogents, and depending on the school of thoughts that you belong to, you might not even think that there are any, or that use cogents should be applied lightly to any domain. So I think the answer to this depends on who you ask. But if I had to choose perhaps I wouldn't say that it's a use cogents rules, but at least something as close to it as I could get, I would say maybe the rule of due regard, which is codified in the Outer Space Treaty in Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, to just respect the space activities of other states. I think is something that should be borne in mind by any actor that carries out activities in outer space, or that seeks to carry out activities in outer space in the future, is something that they should always respect. But other states or non-state actors also want to do, because space, as the Outer Space Treaty indicates, is a domain that should be enjoyed by all. It's for the use and exploration of all states freely.
Thanks, Almudena. I'm looking at Jinwan. I believe that's an old hand, so to speak, that you have raised. But just to check, did you want to follow up on the point Almudena made, or?
Yes, if I may. But Jessica, would you like to speak before me?
Well, sure. I love that question about non-placement of weapons in outer space. Obviously, I work at a arms control and disarmament organization, and preventing the weaponization of space has been a core value, I think, related to Paros for a long time. How do you do it? I'm not sure that's a norm. To me, that's a principle. And the UK has been very smart, in their approach. They've structured this dialogue in terms of principles, norms, and rules. And you really need all three of these. And I think we could start talking about a principle of non-placement of weapons in outer space, but that's not a norm. That's not quite the behavior, because I think from our opening remarks, we heard just how many different kinds of possible weapons there could be in space. And so the next step, if we wanted to go down that route, would be identifying behaviors that would be observable and that would build confidence towards that end, and then coming to land on rules. So I just think that in space, technology has gotten to the point where it's hard to talk about weapons in the abstract. It's really to the point where you need to start talking about specific capabilities. Are we talking about kinetic weapons? Are we talking about cyber interference? Are we talking about the use of directed energy? Similar to the way we've had to break that down on Earth. We don't really have a general approach to weapons, but we've had to have separate conversations and regulations related to different capabilities. So I think that's an important principle. I think calling it a norm is tricky, but it's something that could be worked on, but probably would have to be broken down into many different small pieces in order to make it work and to build confidence and to demonstrate that it's being complied with and not just something that states are saying they're doing.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. Junwan, did you want to take the floor before I change the sort of theme of questioning? Please.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I agree with Almudena on the question of use cogents. I'm also a bit skeptical because when we talk about use cogents, for example, use cogents, for instance, it is some kind of rules which no derogation is permitted, such as, for instance, the prohibition of aggression or the prohibition of genocide, which is universally accepted as non-derogable. And I think in terms of, for our topic today, I think there are different views amongst this on, for instance, on the placement of weapons in outer space or kinetic ASAP test, for example. So I'm a bit skeptical of that. And coming back to the questions, I agree. If a norm, for example, if it is not widely accepted, it cannot be regarded as a norm, as it is. But I think the question here is whether we should regard the non-placement of weapons in space as one of the norms of responsible behavior in space. And I think this is important because states have different concerns, and these concerns, they should be addressed, in a balanced manner in order to garner wide acceptance. And finally, I think we are talking about, so to me, we are talking about norms in general without differentiating different levels between principles, rules, or norms. So I missed that part, which is related to Jessica's comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Jinwan. Now, just on an entirely personal level, it's somewhat of a relief to move from the legal discussion over to social sciences, which is more of a comfort zone for me personally. But we have had a couple of questions on this, so once again, I'll cluster these. The first one relates to how would confidence building measures enable norms in terms of structure and infrastructure and design for space supply and value chains? It's quite a lot to unpack in that question, but I'll offer the floor if anybody wants to take it. But the second one really is a question of, should the focus be upon promoting norms of responsible behavior in space or norms underpinning the management of responsible use of space? So perhaps, Jessica, can I turn to you for those questions first of all, before offering those to the other panelists? Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's a big question, and I'll interpret it in a few different ways. I think infrastructure, space infrastructure is critical, and the protection of critical civilian infrastructure might be one way that we approach norms of responsible behavior in outer space. The ICRC has been doing a lot of work on this, and it ties into other norms about civilian protection, humanitarian norms, and so forth. But if we're thinking about sort of design and supply chain, I mean, immediately things come to mind. When I did my norms mapping exercise last year, there's a lot of emerging best practices when it comes to space system design that I think are becoming norms, maybe not in the national security stream though, but I think it's important when we're talking about space that we realize that we will probably need norms or rules that relate not just to national security or military activities, but also peaceful uses of outer space, civilian and commercial activities, ways in which you demonstrate or ways in which you can differentiate different actors and different uses of space the way we do with other dual use capabilities. And there, I think there's a lot of potential to minimize misunderstandings in space by having certain capabilities, maybe having trackability as part of your system design, or certain communications capabilities as part of your design, so that you can communicate distress or you can communicate with others. So I think there's potential, but I do think broadly norms will be a bit higher level and a bit more broad, but states themselves then will have to also think about how they adhere to those. And a lot of that will then come in on that management side, the domestic rules, the regulations, how do you license, what requirements do you have for space operators to have on their systems. So I like how this very broad discussion on norms opens up so many questions related to how do we design our spacecrafts and our space systems, and how do we regulate our industry, and how do we manage ourselves at the national level as well as at the international level.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Does anybody else want to take on either of those questions in response? So a question about confidence building measures, enable norms in terms of structure, infrastructure and design, or questions on promoting norms of responsible behavior or norms underpinning the management of responsible use of space. Anybody, Jinwan or Amadena? Amadena, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, so I'll take the last question that you mentioned, if I may, the one on promoting norms of responsible behavior in space or norms underpinning the management of the responsible use of space. I don't think these have to be opposing concepts at all. I think that they are very much linked. If you seek to have a responsible use of space or a management of a responsible use of space, is because you are encouraging behaviors, you're encouraging actors to behave responsibly when they use space. So in this sense, I think that they could, perhaps I'm not understanding the question correctly, but I definitely think that they could be understood as very similar in the sense that the end goal is the same. So I think this focus on behaviors is very interesting in a field like space, where technology evolves so fast that focusing, when regulating the use of space, focusing on capabilities can become outdated very fast due to the fact that the technology is constantly changing. And so focusing on behaviors might be a useful solution to avoid that decay of regulations, or having them become less effective over time, essentially. And I think that eventually this leads to the responsible use of space. If states and non-state actors both behave responsibly when carrying out activities in outer space. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Almudena. And I think, Jess, is that a new hand, so to speak, that you raised? Please, then I'll turn to Simon. Please, Jess.
It was. I forgot one of my favorite examples. So it's not about designing systems from a hardware perspective per se, but how do we design space missions in a way that build confidence among others? And I think Japan is really leading the way when it comes to how do we use a new technology and a new capability in a way that is not threatening to others, that builds confidence, that's safe and reassuring. And their approach to trying to really support a new industry for debris removal, which could be perceived by some as a threatening capability, their commitment to really extreme transparency, communication, safety. I think that's one way to think about how norms of behavior can build transparency and confidence, and also allow an industry using new space technologies to flourish at the same time. It's essential, but it also helps mitigate potential security concerns among different states that might not have the same views of the technology and the actors. So again, it's that play that you get between peaceful uses and maybe less peaceful uses, civil, commercial, military, and just how important the rules are in a domain that is used by so many different actors, has rapidly changing but fascinating and really useful new technical capabilities, and really has a need for greater confidence, trust, and transparency. So I think they're setting a wonderful example of how to move forward on some of these issues, obviously in a commercial and civilian context.
Thank you. I think I'll stop the panel there per se. I think it's certainly quite a rich discussion with plenty of ideas and food for thought, both in terms of some of the challenges and the complexity, but also some of the opportunities for moving forward. At this time, though, I'd like to turn the floor over to Simon Clearbury. Simon is the Deputy Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom's Conference on Disarmament, and is going to deliver some closing remarks. And with that, I'll hand the floor over to you, Simon, please.
Jamie, thank you very much indeed, and hello to everyone. Let me thank you, Jamie, and the panelists very, very much indeed for such a great discussion. And particularly in the way that you're helping us to gear up for the OEWG that is coming next year, and throwing out some great things, some great questions and issues that we will need to think through. And I particularly valued also some of the challenge that you gave to this as well, because I think it's important that we understand the limitations as well as all the upsides of talking about norms. So I appreciated that, and I think It certainly made me think that we have a lot to talk about, and that we have a lot of issues that we need to think through. And also, I thought there were some great questions that came in from the audience as well. So thank you to those of you who submitted questions. It certainly is an important time for those of us working on space security. The overwhelming support in the UN General Assembly for the UK's resolution on space behaviours shows that there is a groundswell of support and interest amongst spacefaring and non-spacefaring states to ensure that space continues to deliver all those great benefits that Pedro was talking about at the start to our life on Earth. Given recent events, the increasing congestion in space and the increase in geopolitical rivalry, it's even more important that the international community comes together now to ensure a peaceful space environment. The number one aim of our initiative on responsible behaviours is to prevent miscalculation and escalation from hostile activity against space systems leading to conflict. In other words, we want to keep all space systems secure in what we call the sub-conflict or competition phase. And our initiative is about the link between a behavior to a perception of a threat. And by this we mean, if you do something and I don't understand what or why you're doing it, then I might perceive that to be a threat. And we believe that a misunderstanding like that, a misunderstanding in space, could lead to conflict on Earth. And that really is what has driven our initiative. And by focusing on intent and observable behavior rather than capabilities, we believe it is possible to create a set of practices or behaviors which might increase trust and foster greater transparency. Just to say, we're very much, our initiative is very much talking about state behavior. Companies, the private sector, don't display responsible space behaviors themselves. Their operations follow rules, regulations, and legislation, and they develop best practice. But its national legislation and regulation should be aligned with that agreed internationally, such as issues negotiated and agreed in COPUOS and designed to implement the 21 guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space. Another aspect of our initiative that I'd like to stress is the way we talk about space systems. And by this, we mean satellites, ground infrastructure, and the data links. Other initiatives have too narrowly talked about objects in space, and we believe that that's insufficient. We've talked a lot about the importance of identifying threats. Threats come from states and are against any part of the space system to stop you using it for the purpose that it's intended. For example, a missile could destroy a satellite, or a jammer could prevent you receiving an image. So just focusing on what we want to get out of the open-ended working group, which will start next year. Firstly, and a lot of the panelists have said this, it's a great opportunity for space security experts to come together and to talk and to start to build a shared understanding of what responsible behavior is. Secondly, we hope that we can build an international consensus against behaviors that threaten to bring conflict to space. And thirdly, and finally, we would like to produce, I guess, incrementally, a list of agreed operational and strategic behaviors that reduce the risk of conflict starting into and through space. We believe that states will self-limit their actions if they understand them to be internationally unacceptable and or likely to lead to conflict. Perhaps just a few practical points now about the OEWG itself. Of course, we've had the vote in the first committee. It will be voted on in the plenary of the General Assembly, we think actually just before Christmas. And then there won't be much time between that and actually the OEWG itself getting going, because the organizational meeting is scheduled for early February, and then the first week of the group's work will be later on towards the end of February. And of course it will be in Geneva, and we did that deliberately because we think that the delegations have the greatest expertise on space security issues here in Geneva because of the delegation, particularly because of the delegations to the Conference on Disarmament. Other than the appointment of a chair, which UNODA will lead on, an important early thing to decide on will be the programme of work. And we hope that this will map what we put in the mandate, in the resolution, that the mandate has 4 parts. And one way of organising the work would be to take a week for each of those 4 parts. So the first week we would do the stock take on existing international law. Then we would move to consider what are the current and future threats that we see out there. And then in the 3rd week, I guess the really crucial week, which would come in the 2nd year, we would seek to make or agree on recommendations on possible norms, rules, and principles. And then the final week could be spent on finalising, hopefully, a consensus report. Depending on how the chair and the secretariat want to run the group's work, I think we may work on elements of the report as we go. So the final day of each week would be dedicated to trying to agree language on the discussions of that week. Just a word on inclusivity and interest and engagement, as Jessica said. We're very pleased with how much interest there has been and how much support there's been for our initiative. We now have a new inclusive UN process to take the discussions forward. And we do want all states to have a voice, and for it to be done in such a way that doesn't disadvantage those that perhaps have less expertise in space issues. And we hope also there will be a broad engagement from civil society, private sector, academia, and other international organizations. I think events like this one, and at this point I'm going to say thank you very much to UNODA and the government of Spain for putting on this event. I think it'd be great to see more events like this throughout the 2-year life of the OEWG, because it's not just the discussions that will happen in those 4 weeks, it's the discussions that will happen in the intersessional period, the discussions that will happen between the chair and interested stakeholders that will really help drive this forward. So big thank you for kind of kicking us off with the event today. Whoever ends up chairing, we do hope that he or she will participate in events like this and do lots of regional and sub-regional consultations and engagement with all the relevant stakeholders to ensure not only that it's inclusive, but also that everyone, that we maintain the levels of engagement and that we make everyone feel part of it and actually feel able to contribute and share their views. Just finally, before I hand back to you, Jamie, it's not long to go now. February will come up on us very quickly, and particularly I'm thinking of the disarmament calendar here in Geneva. There's a lot of work to come on other issues between now and then. But thank you very much for this excellent kind of scene setter for the work that the OEWG is going to do, and for throwing out many of the issues that we will need to consider, and also for throwing out a bit of challenge. I think it's always important to do that, and we certainly have not we've certainly not started this new process thinking that we have all the answers. We really want to hear from everyone else, and we want to have a conversation to build that common understanding that has been mentioned a lot during the course of the event. So my thanks again to you, Jamie, and the panelists, and to the government of Spain for their sponsorship. And with that, I will hand back to you, Jamie. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. I think just from our side, space is clearly an important area of research for UNODA moving forward. We're certainly looking forward to engaging further on issues related to space security and space governance, drawing on a wide range of different perspectives. I think it's a potentially useful role that we can play. So, and I realise it's potentially a very terrible pun, but watch this space. I'm glad people are muted to avoid the groans. More seriously though, if I could just say thank you to all of the panelists, thank you to the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation for co-organisation of this event. And of course, thank you to Pedro for the comments and making opening remarks, and to you, Simon, for providing some closing remarks. These events often require people doing a lot of work behind the scenes. So if I could just say thanks to Elena Krabil and Maria Garzon Maceda, who have done a lot of the work sort of setting this up, scripting, organising those things. And last but not least, but thank you to those of you in the audience for joining this event. You will receive an email from the Unideer team requesting feedback on this event. We do encourage you to contribute. You can also be completed through the link, which I think should be in the chat window. If I could encourage you to fill this in, it is really helpful for us moving forward to sort of improve and develop our events. We do appreciate that. And on that note, I'll now close, but thank you to everybody, and yeah, all the best.